There we go.
And while Sarah is doing the housekeeping, good afternoon, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Um, just the way that we're going to do this is that we're going to have Brian start the presentation, his presentation of his paper. We'll open it up for a very short Q&A on clarification questions if there's something specific that you need explained a little bit better. Then John will present his work. Again, we'll open it up to a very quick clarification question and answers. And then I'll be the discussant and kind of give an overview of a couple of different ideas and then specific comments on both papers. And then we'll open it up to a general discussion.
Great, thanks, Steve. I just want to let everyone know that we are recording this presentation. It will be recorded and posted on the AAEA YouTube channel in perpetuity. I also want to put in a plug for the September CRENET Virtual session, which will be focused on community and regional economics extension, searching for sustainability. Presenters will be Brian Whitaker talking about e-connectivity programs, Rebecca Dudenzing and her colleagues Francisco and Ashley on tying community economic development extension to ag, youth, and health extension. And finally, Mallory Ray and Stephen McKembo from University of Missouri talking about the evolving transition in community and regional economics extension. A link for that, a registration link, I will pop into the chat. Finally, today we will be using the chat function in this Zoom webinar. So this is not a Zoom meeting where everybody can see everyone's face. You can only see the face of panelists, which are generally presenters and co-authors. So if you'd like to ask a question, please put that question into the chat. Dr. Deller and I will be manning the chat, and we'll try and take those questions as we can. I think everyone should be familiar with the chat function in the Zoom webinar. And with that, I think we can go ahead and get started. Brian, you want to share your screen?
Sure. How's that, everybody? Everybody see my opening slide there? Okay, well, thank you all for attending this first virtual session of the AIEA annual meeting. Thanks to Sarah for hosting and to John Pender for suggesting this topic. I'm pretty proud of this paper. It's actually one that's forthcoming in telecommunications policy. I'd hope to be able to share a link with you all, but it's not posted yet, so it should be in the coming days. So the title of our paper is State Broadband Policy Impacts on Availability. This is joint work with Roberto Gallardo at Purdue, and I've been glancing through the participants list here. I see a lot of familiar names that do awesome work on broadband, so we're excited to share this with you guys and see what you think. So let me go ahead and kind of move forward to what we hope to discuss. So we all know that broadband is an important topic for community development, rural development in general. A lot of people on this call, like I said, have published really great work on what broadband can mean for rural communities, why it's important. And that first bullet there says it's even more important nowadays, right? We've seen the headlines about what's required during COVID-19, and I'll get to a little bit more of that later. So just in terms of what the data says, we know that rural lags urban. No surprise there, right? If you look at some of the statistics I'll show later, there was about an 8 percentage point gap in 2012, and that's continued up through 2018. We still have about an 8 percentage point gap, 71 versus 79% with availability. And I'm going to reference this 25 free speeds over and over again. Hopefully most of you on the call know that's the FCC threshold for broadband speeds. So 25 megabits download, 3 upload. So I'm going to get to some literature here in a second, but we know broadband is important for economic outcomes, both rural and urban. And like I said, I've got a literature review section that discusses that. But what's not really been examined to date is what states have done in terms of broadband policy. So states have done a lot of different things over the years. You can see some highlights here on the right. You know, California established a council pretty early on, like 2010. They had a council that was working on this issue. You can see New York had a federal or a funding program as of 2015. There was some legislation in Utah that actually made municipal broadband more problematic in 2013. So they've all taken different approaches. And so we're going to try to evaluate a couple of those policies based on some data that has recently become available. So you can see some of the ones that we're going to mention: state broadband offices with full-time employees, state-level funding mechanisms, and restrictions on cooperatives and municipalities from providing broadband, which I see some people on here have done some good work in that area as well. So short answer is we don't know. There's no empirical evidence on what state policies have worked, and that's for a couple reasons. So, and I'll get to those a little bit later on, but this is kind of the first approach at attempting to answer that question. So we know that broadband access is important. As I said, there have been some really good papers that have shown, yes, broadband does matter for where rural businesses choose to locate. Okay, there was a nice AJA article a couple years ago that found that. A paper one of my grad students authored almost a decade ago showed, yes, it does matter for where rural people choose to live, choose to migrate to. And then Steve and I had a paper last year that looked at, said, yes, it does matter for housing values in rural areas. And so this actually is a nice quote from the person that authored the National Broadband Plan that came out in 2010, Blair Levin, and he says, even though we had this great National Broadband Plan 10 years ago, we're still a ways away, okay? And so that's what we're trying to do is figure out what can we do to improve the connectivity situation and take advantage of broadband. And so you guys have probably seen a lot of these headlines in the news. Telehealth is, if you're gonna have telehealth, you've gotta have a broadband connection. Just COVID-19 in general, we talk about student access, you talk about working from home. All these things are why broadband is crucial for rural America. So if you look at what previous research has drummed up on broadband policy, there's surprisingly little on what US policy efforts have been able to accomplish. There was one early study by Scott Walston back, it was over 15 years ago now, and he actually did try to look at some state and federal policies at that time, and they found generally that they were ineffective. So he looked at things like tax incentives and USF funds and municipal restrictions and found, again, this was back in 2005, prior to 2005, very few of them had any kind of impact. A couple other studies that looked at policies trying to increase demand and showing that those actually did have some impact. And then Angela Seifer, who is the director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, had a nice paper in 2015 that kind of laid out what she thought were some good state broadband policies were, but she didn't really document what their impacts were. So she just kind of said, we think these are good policies. We can't really tell you how much of an impact they had. And that was because there was really no clear source of information on what different states were doing. And I was actually just thinking here today that it's been about a year since I first learned about this data set of what states are doing in terms of broadband policy. So frankly, that's almost working at light speed in academia, is to learn about a data set and in 1 year get something published. So I'm really proud of that. So I'll talk more about that data set that's become available and what we did with it. There is some international work that has been on this topic, and you can see Ghosh in 2017 looked at 15 Middle Eastern, North Africa countries and just looked at, did they have a national broadband plan in place, and found that those that did, there was a positive impact in terms of availability. Other studies have really just kind of lamented the fact that there's not a lot of evidence on how these different policies have impacted things. So we're trying to address that issue. So bottom line, the existing literature really doesn't talk about how effective the state level policy in the US is. We have some studies that have looked at federal programs, and in fact, John's going to talk about one of those after me, but there's very little on state level broadband policy. So the main question we want to try to answer is, do state level policies impact overall broadband availability? And in particular, specifically for rural areas, right? Those are the ones that are lagging further behind. We want to focus in on those rural parts of the country. We're going to use a couple of other outcome variables in addition to just overall availability, and I'll talk about those in a second, but that's the main question is, do these policies impact availability, and if so, to what extent? So we're going to examine 3 specific broadband policies, and I'll talk more about these later, but you can get an overview here and some examples of what's happening in different states. So you can see down here, Wisconsin has their broadband expansion grants, so that's an example of a state level funding mechanism. Here is Minnesota's Office of Broadband Development. That's an example of these state level broadband offices. And then we've got a map from Broadband Now showing the different states that have restrictions on municipal broadband cooperative, electric cooperative provision of broadband. So different states are doing different things, and we're trying to figure out what kind of an impact they have. So here's where my buddy Roberto was crucial. We pulled data from the existing sources of broadband. So the National Broadband Map was the provider of data from 2010 to 2013. That's different than the current data set that we have from the FCC. The NBM was put together, every state had their own entity that contributed to that. So the data quality there was questionable. We'll get back to that here at a later time, but this is low-level data, census block level data. And so Roberto pulled this every year at the block level and then aggregated it up to the county level so we could get some percentages of population with access to 25 free speeds. And I mentioned the other availability metrics we're interested in. We want to look at fiber access. So if you think general broadband availability is this 25 free threshold, fiber is more like a gigabit. So it's 50 times faster than the threshold. And then we also looked at competition, the percentage of the population with at least 2 providers offering broadband. And then Roberto also compiled this rural-only metrics using blocks, the census blocks that were classified as rural in 2010. So again, each county has their own rural-only metric of availability. The primary independent variables that we want to evaluate are these state broadband policies. I'll talk more about that in a second. And then we've got a bunch of controls. So things we think are going to affect availability like income, education, poverty, population density. You can see our other controls and sources there. We end up with a panel data set we got 7 years of data from 2012 through 2018 for basically all of our counties, 3,140. You can see I excluded a few of the National Broadband Map early years. 10 and 11 are pretty bad in terms of the data quality. The states were just starting to figure out how to compile this stuff. And so we really only have a couple years from that earlier period of analysis. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So this is the data that just became available. And this is from our friends over at the Pew Charitable Trust. Like I said, I learned about it about a year ago in July 2019. And what they did is they had some people who reviewed literally all state-level statutes, executive orders, governing directives for any kind of broadband-related terms. And they put this together back to 1991, I think was the first one where they had something relevant to broadband. So we came up with this panel data set of what statutes were in place or what policies were in place in every state for our period 2012 to 2018. It's really the first comprehensive collection of state-level policies. If you guys haven't seen it, here's kind of what it looks like over on the right. The problem was when we started to dig into it, we had some issues in terms of actually assigning some of these policies. So a statute might say, yes, we're going to establish a task force, but then we don't know if they actually had any full-time employees or if it was just someone's 0.5 hours a week working on this. We wanted only the ones that had a full-time employee associated with it. We know some organizations became defunct and were not captured in our data set. And so we actually reached out to, there's a state broadband leaders network that's compiled by NTIA. We have members in all 50 states. And so I literally sent out at least 50 different emails, I think it was late last year, early this year, to all the states and said, here's what we have for you guys. Tell me if this is correct or not. And I got responses from 62% of them. So thanks to those of you who were on this call that did respond. And you can see, I'll show you here in a second what the resulting data set looked like. So here's an example. So this is for the state level broadband funds that actually had some funds that were expended. And you can see it's 2010 through 2018 for every state, when they had funds in place, when they were expended. And you can see a lot of zeros there. You can also see on the bottom how it changed from only 4 in 2010 all the way up to 18 by 2018. Okay, so this is the kind of policy data that we use in our paper. So turning to our some descriptive statistics from the data we mentioned. First thing to note is that this is the percentage of county population with access to broadband. So it was about 32% in 2012. That jumped all the way up to 79% in 2018. You can see there are other outcome measures there. The fiber percent went from about 7.5 up to 25. So we're seeing growth in all of these. And we can see the rural breakouts as well. And then the number of people who have access to 2 or more providers. There's only 4.5 in 2012, up to 35 in 2018. We also have some measures on policies. So out of all of our counties, 9.86 were in states that had a funding program in 2012, and that jumped up to 33 in 2018. So we're seeing increases, generally speaking, in terms of what the states are doing for policies. And we got a few more slides on that. So I want to talk about this because I know it's going to be discussed probably ad nauseum today. The broadband data stinks. Okay, we've got a lot of news articles about how rosy a picture that the FCC is painting of broadband access. There's been a really neat study where they actually went to the providers that said, yes, I do provide access in these areas. And then they did an autofill for their online tools that say, okay, now that you've told me you offer here, let me actually sign up for it. And a significant portion have come back and saying, oh, sorry, we actually don't provide there. So there are major problems with this broadband data. The biggest critique is that if anybody in a census block has coverage, then that counts the entire block as being served. We also note that they are only look at advertised speeds, not actual speeds. There's no cost data. You can see down here that some providers are giving false information. So there are incorrect submissions by providers as kind of an incentive for them to overstate their case. Our point is it's still the best thing that we have. There's no really way to easily account for this overstatement, these specific studies that found, failing to count particular portions of people. We can't really adjust for that by state or by county. So we're kind of just using it what it is. And, maybe a future area for work is to, if we do get better data, maybe go back and try this again and see if it comes up with the same findings. So we still think it's reasonable to use this data. I know John's going to offer maybe an alternative solution for his paper. So here's what the data says in terms of broadband availability. You do see a break here between the earlier version of the broadband data through National Broadband Map and then the FCC. So you can kind of see how that's working out. And then I do want to point out these are county averages. So if there's one county with 1 million people that has 100% access and another county with 3,000 people with 0% access, then the average is just 50%. And that's different from what the FCC is going to say because they're going to weight theirs on population. So if you look through the FCC reports, you'll see they're going to say it's closer to 93, 94% of everyone has broadband access. That's the rosy picture that they're talking about. Ours are county level weightings. So here's the policies that are available. You can see a dramatic increase in the number of state broadband offices. You can see a dramatic increase in the number of state broadband funding mechanisms and a slight reduction in those states that restrict municipal broadband provision. You can see here Colorado went from a 1 to a 0, and I think Tennessee went from a 1 to a 0. So there are some that are removing them, but there's still a lot in place. So this is our policy level variables, and you can kind of look down through here. These are the rest of the demographics. So we have kind of population over time, median household income, population density. So you can kind of look through these and see, make sure they're making sense, and generally we think they are. I do have some instrumental variables down here that I'll talk about a little bit later, and that well, I'll just note those a little bit later. So you can see again we have 3,140 observations in each year, and so we have this panel data set. So I'm going to turn to the empirical specification, and when I first tried to do this analysis, I still don't have a lot of experience with panel data, and I tried to just do a traditional fixed effects model. So I didn't have this lag term on the right-hand side. I just said, okay, I'm going to model availability based on my control variables and my policy variables and counting in year fixed effects. And the results were terrible. So I was getting things like, oh, there's a positive impact of poverty on availability and a negative impact of population density on availability. I was like, something is not right here. So thankfully, we have Dayton Lambert here at Oklahoma State, and he said, oh, you probably need to think about this dynamic panel regression because your availability at time t is clearly dependent on the availability in the prior period, right? So that makes sense to me, and so I started to think about this. And as you walk through this analysis, you quickly figure out that in this dynamic panel regression, the issue is these regressors are not all exogenous. In particular, this lagged availability term is correlated with this error term, okay? And so that's well known in the economic literature. It's this thing called nickel bias. There was a really famous econometrical article back in 1981, and these guys, a lot smarter than me, figured out, okay, here's what we do about it. We don't just use this traditional lagged version, we can first difference things. And so when you first difference things, that gets rid of these counting fixed effects, and we are now looking at changes in policy over time. Okay, so we kind of have gotten rid of that one problem with this exogeneity. The still problem that we have is that other variables are still endogenous to our outcome measure. Okay, and in particular, maybe these states that are really lagging behind in terms of availability, they might enact more policies, right? Or maybe the ones that are doing better might say, hey, let's keep it up, let's do more. So there's this issue of endogeneity for our policy variables, and so we attempt to solve that with instrumental variables. And one particular mechanism for doing that is this generalized method of moments. And so I hadn't used this technique at all before this paper, and so I quickly uncovered the literature, and I would recommend to you guys this very short 50-page Rudman article in the Stata Journal. And so I've probably read this thing maybe 7 or 8 times now, and I finally think I understand it. But it's very well cited. It's actually a really well done article. That's why it's cited 7,000 times. So GMM, Generalized Method of Moments, has 2 options. You can do a difference GMM, where in the first difference specification that we discussed, the instruments that you use are those same independent variables in level terms. So that's kind of the cool thing that they use, is they say we kind of have these built-in instruments for our first difference specification. We're just going to use them in level terms. Okay, and then the system GMM takes that a step further. So you've got a system of equations, not only the first difference equation, but also the level equation, that original equation in levels, where now we change the instruments to being the lagged first differences. So it's kind of a neat way to come up with your own set of instruments. And again, these really smart guys show that the system approach has better asymptotic properties and consistent parameter estimates, et cetera. And you know, it's heavily used in these small t, large n data sets. So we have 7 years of data and 3,140 counties, so it fits pretty well with what we're doing. So we can also use traditional instruments in addition to the ones that are kind of built into the system, and I chose 2 that I thought were kind of interesting. We have this data from the NCSL on the percentage of state legislators who are Republican, and you can pull that by year. And we can also identify what we call the conservative advantage. These are residents of a state, and how the percentage that identifies conservative, the percentage that identifies liberal, and kind of the difference between those 2. So we can go across the years and look at these ways of classifying people who live in the states. The hypothesis is that these are going to be good instruments because they would be related to policies enacted, but not necessarily overall broadband availability. Okay, and so they end up working pretty well when we test them with our specification. So that's the additional instruments we use. So here's the nuts and bolts of the results. We've got 3 outcome measures we're interested in: any kind of availability, fiber availability, and then 2+ competitors. Okay, the first thing to note is that the controls are pretty intuitive. This education is positively related to availability. Poverty is negatively related to availability. Population density, positive. Rural percentage of population, negative. The only one that is a little questionable is this percent housing after 2010. You think, why would that be negative? The idea here, I think, is that if you think about houses that were built relatively recently, those are going to be in the newer areas of the state, right? Or newer population densities. So they might undercount the traditional DSL and cable providers. So we think that might be why we saw a negative sign there. The good thing is we did see a positive and significant sign for fiber, which makes sense. So generally speaking, all these results made intuitive sense to us, which is a nice step. This is what we're really interested in. What happened? What did the policies show? And the first thing to note is that if you have municipal restrictions in your state, you can see a 1.8 to a 3.1 reduction in availability, okay? That's never been shown before, at least to my knowledge, that if you have these restrictions in place, it is gonna lower your broadband availability across the state. We also show that the availability of state funding programs has a 1.2 to 2.0% increase in availability. Okay, and those are significant at different levels, but we do find a pretty significant impact for fiber in particular. And then the state office, we did find a positive impact of them just for the level of competition available. Okay, so we found some evidence of state office effectiveness, definitely impacts for municipal restrictions and state funding programs. When we restricted our analysis to just rural, you can see here, this is the full sample, 18,800 observations. If we only, they do pass all the specification tests. The Hansen J test, we say our instruments are valid. We expect to fail the AR1 because we include that lagged availability term. And we passed the AR2 saying that we don't need a second lag of availability. So when we focus now just on rural, you can see our number of observations a little bit lower because not all counties have rural census tracts in them. And you can see, again, the controls are pretty intuitive. They all kind of make sense. Higher levels of population lead to more availability, generally speaking, more competition, and you can see, again, poverty negatively associated with availability. So they all kind of make sense. And the same kind of results. Okay, so we can see our municipal restrictions lower availability by 2 to 4 percentage points, and the state funds are going to increase availability by 1 to 2%. Okay, so some people might say, well, you really are looking at state policies. Why don't you just do a state level analysis? The problem is it just really affects our sample size, right? We had 3,000 counties times 7, which was 21,000 observations. That drops us to only 350 if we do a state level analysis. We don't have as much power. We did run this and it didn't look good. Most of the controls lost significance. No policy variables had any significance, and we failed the Hansen J test because we had a small number of observations and a pretty large number of instruments once we did the panel regression technique. So to conclude, I'm not sure if Steve's going to kick me off here or not. I think I'm doing okay. Oh, maybe not. I'll be quick. There's a strong argument that state broadband policies are having an impact, particularly those states that still have these restrictions on municipal programs. We're arguing you got to get rid of those. That's not an effective way. We can also show that the funding programs have a positive impact. We try to quantify these. We'd say a typical county could go from 71% availability up to 77 if they did both of these policies. I'm going to give this to the state broadband offices next week, and I don't want them to feel like their efforts have been wasted for the past 5-7 years. There are only a positive impact for a couple of outcomes of these offices. We kind of want to emphasize that really these investments have only been recent, right? They increased dramatically from 2014 to 2018, and the benefits associated with an office might take time to accrue. They do a lot of work on outreach and capacity building, and Pew has this nice report that highlights some of the promising practices and the kind of recent momentum in legislative changes just for 2019. So these are the ones that are after our period of analysis. And then to kind of conclude, in terms of limitations, I don't do anything with federal investments. I filed the Freedom of Information Act to try to get county level expenditures for some of these big programs, and the data that they came back with was unusable, so I didn't even try anymore. I did quickly look at whether states that had broadband offices were more successful in getting these funds, and they were not. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. Maybe we can talk about later. I'm sure we're going to get back to this one. Some reviewers had some good comments trying to think about what does that mean? What does the fact that the broadband data stinks means? And so I kind of came up with, well, if it's improved over time, that actually might be an understatement of the impacts. But if it's still terrible, and these areas are recently shown as incorrectly having access, that would be an overstatement of the impacts. And certainly a limitation is I just gave everything a 0-1. If you have a funding program or not. There were states that gave $3 million. There were states that gave $500 million. So we need to do a little bit more analysis of the heterogeneity that exists there. Certainly some state offices have a lot more employees. There's a lot less restrictions on others. And so that's it. I know I sped through that kind of quickly, but I'll turn it over. Steve, did you want to have some quick comments?
Thank you, Brian. I think if there's anybody that has a quick clarification question, I think we can take that now. You can put it in the chat box. Otherwise, what we will do is, if there are no quick clarification questions, what we'll do is just move it on to John and have him present, and then bring the general comments after John's. There was one question, will the presenters make their PowerPoints available? And I kind of responded that if they just drop you an email, that you'd be pleased to share it with them. And that the session is being recorded and it's going to be posted in the AAEA YouTube channel. And I think, Sarah, once that's posted, we could probably send a note out to the CRENET listserv.
Yeah, everyone who registered for today's webinar will get that link to the YouTube, and we'll also send that out on the CRENET listserv too. Okay.
I'm not seeing any questions being thrown into the chat box. I think that's a reflection of Brian, the clarity of your presentation.
That's true.
And we are going to turn you into an econometrician slowly but surely.
Maybe in 10 years.
All right, having seen none, no comments, no questions, John, do you want to go ahead and share your screen and start your presentation? And sure. Got about 25 minutes thereabouts.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Steve. Can anybody see my screen?
I can see your screen. You just need to start the show.
Slideshow. Okay. There we go. Come on. There we go. All right. So this, I'm going to be talking about the impacts of the Broadband Initiatives Program. That's a federal broadband program that was part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. This work is a collaboration with several colleagues at the University of Virginia Social and Decision Analytics Division, and then Zachary Keeler, who's a former intern with me, who's at West Virginia, a grad student at West Virginia University. This work is still a little bit preliminary. Like Brian, we got our data even more recently, just a few months ago, and so we're still, kind of crunching over the data, but this is what we have so far. So I won't spend too much time on the rationale. Brian covered that pretty well. We know that broadband is an important priority, and there's been recent investment, almost $2 billion in the last 3 fiscal years for the new ReConnect program, which is funding USDA promotion of rural broadband. It's a new program. And then, of course, there's several other USDA and FCC programs that are also promoting broadband investments. And as Brian said, we know that broadband is even more important, or its importance is really evident in the current pandemic. I mean, just the fact of what we're doing right now is dependent upon broadband, and telework and telehealth, and so many things are dependent on that. So despite the importance of this topic and the amount that's being invested in many of these programs, there's very limited research that's looked at the impacts of broadband programs. Brian mentioned about state policies and programs. There's a bit more research at the federal level, that primarily by Ivan Kandeloff and his co-authors. There have been several papers looking at the impacts of various economic outcomes from the Rural Broadband Program, which is also called the Farm Bill Broadband Program or the Broadband Loan Program. All of those papers have looked at outcomes prior to 2010. And there's also one of those papers looked at impacts of the Community Connect grant program. Those are also looking at impacts prior to 2010. So those are, I think, important papers. Nothing that looks at anything after 2010, and no papers that I've seen, or even drafts of papers or anything that looked at the Broadband Initiatives Program, which interestingly, it's like by far the largest program promoting rural broadband to date. So it's much larger than these other programs that have been studied a little bit. So the purpose of this study is to start to investigate some of those impacts. I won't belabor this slide, which is this kind of standard setup here. So what questions are we looking at? So we asked basically, what are the impacts of the Broadband Initiatives Program on broadband availability, use, and on a few selected economic outcomes? In terms of outcomes, we want to look at property values and household income. The reason for selecting those outcomes is that if we want to start moving towards understanding the returns, sort of what are the economic returns to broadband investments by various government programs, then we need to look at these kinds of outcomes, knowing that infrastructure investments can be capitalized into property values to some extent, and also be affecting household incomes. We look at broadband availability at use because those are kind of sort of the intermediate effects, that unless a program is increasing availability and use, then you might, wonder why would it be having any effects on economic outcomes. So we also want to look at that as instrumental outcomes. And then we're also interested in looking at the kind of heterogeneity of impacts across the rural-urban continuum and across, areas by what their initial levels of availability and use were. So there are quite a few federal broadband programs. I'm not going to read all, go through all these. I don't have time. But just the point is that there are a lot of ongoing programs. The USDA has 5 programs of its own, and then FCC has several programs. And as I mentioned, the 2 that have been looked at for USDA programs are the Rural Broadband Program and the Community Connect grants. But you do have other programs. And of course, the largest, as I've mentioned, are the ones that were funded by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009. So you had 2 very large programs. One was the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program of almost $5 billion invested by NTIA. That was through primarily a competitive grants approach. And it was focused on unserved and unserved areas, but was not really focused on rural areas. The Broadband Initiatives Program was really established to promote investments in rural areas. It was a $2.5 billion appropriation, and it provided grants, loans, and a combination of the two to promote broadband development in underserved and unserved rural areas. All of those awards under those programs were made in 2 rounds in fiscal 2010. So this slide shows just a map of most of these programs. This is from the Rural Utilities Service, a map from last year. And so you don't see much of the Reconnect program on there yet as of last year. But the point I'm making with this slide in this map is that the blue color is showing the Broadband Initiative Program project service areas. So they're pretty widespread throughout much of the country. A bit more in certain areas of the country, but it's a pretty widespread program, much more than the Farm Bill Broadband Borrowers, which is this sort of pinkish color, for example, which is the one that has been studied a bit. So why did we focus on BIP, the Broadband Initiatives Program? It's focused on rural areas mainly. It's unprecedented scale in terms of the amount invested, the lack of prior research on this, the impacts of that program, and the fact that there's been sufficient time to try to measure impact. These programs, typically to build out the infrastructure, it'll take up to 3 years or so. So even though this was funded in 2010, the impacts probably weren't going to start be much evident until, say, around 2013 or so. So the areas that were eligible for the program, they weren't entirely rural, so you have many metro areas, as I'll show, that also got BIP funds, but at least 3/4 of the project area had to be a rural area with insufficient access to high-speed broadband. And rural was defined in the same way as in the other broadband loan program. And insufficient high-speed broadband access was defined at the time as not having access at a combined speed of 5 megabits per second upstream plus downstream in at least half of the project area. So you can see that these, at least 50%, at least 75% kind of thresholds mean that you could still have places that were fairly well served or that were non-rural included in the projects. The vast majority of the projects were last mile infrastructure projects, 96% of them. There was funding also for some middle mile infrastructure projects. And then in the second round, there were projects that supported, so the infrastructure projects basically supported terrestrial broadband infrastructure, but then in the second round you had some satellite broadband and then some other technical assistance and support for rural libraries and so on. In the first round, there was an emphasis in the grants, at least, of supporting remote unserved areas and rural areas. That requirement was relaxed in the second round. And in the second round, it was basically a standard 75% grant, 25% loan that was provided to the recipients. Overall, for the infrastructure projects, there were almost 300 loan and/or grant projects that were approved. 37 of those were rescinded. So you ended up with 260 completed, as I say, almost entirely last mile projects, and almost 2/3 of those provided fiber optic to the household. So the data, we have 3 data sources that we use for this study. One is from the USDA Rural Utility Service. We're very grateful that we've reached an agreement and they've been able to share the data with their shape files of the project service areas, and then also data in spreadsheet files that has the information on the particular projects, their sizes of the grants and loans, and when they were provided, and so on. So it took them a lot of work to actually combine those 2 data sets together, so I'm very appreciative. We also use publicly available FCC data at the census tract level on number of internet service providers over in 2 periods, 2011 and 2016, and also the share of households with an internet subscription in those same years. These are at different upload and download speeds, what's available in the FCC data. We didn't use the indicator that Brian talked about for the estimate of percent of households with access because of the problems that Brian alluded to, and also the fact that you have a different data source for that in 2011 with the National Broadband Map. We chose 2011 as the initial period because there are earlier FCC data prior to 2011, but those use the 2000 rather than the 2010 census tracts. And so that creates problems of examining changes over time. And then we also used ACS, American Community Survey, census tract level data. Certainly we got a lot of data on various demographic and socioeconomic characteristics that we're trying to control for in our analysis at the initial period. But then we also have 2 indicators, the median house value and the median household income. We look at the changes of those from the 2009 to 13 period up to the 2014 to 2018 period. Those are 2 of the dependent variables in our analysis. And we also use ACS data on the household subscriptions in 2014 to 18 to compare to the FCC subscription data, and that's part of our robustness checking, where we use census tracts where the data matched up in a robustness check, and I'll talk about that later. So the characteristics, so this takes a little explaining. So I'm showing some of the descriptive data for the census tracts that we included in our analysis. So we wanted to focus on tracts that were affected only by the Broadband Initiatives Program, or BIP. So we selected tracts that had 90% or more of their area in a BIP-only project service area. So we're not including tracts that had BIP and other programs, projects, service areas involved. There were actually more than 3,000 tracts that there was some BIP, involvement. But so we're trying to make a clean analysis focusing just on impacts of BIP, and we're comparing those to nearby census tracts that are within 50 miles of those BIP-only tracts, but that also had no programs in them. So those comparison tracts, there were over 31,000 of those. So now looking at the characteristics, so one thing to note here, we're looking at, by metropolitan, micropolitan, and so on. Almost half of the BIP-only tracts were in metropolitan, what we consider metropolitan tracts, even though this is a rural-focused program. So some of those restrictions are not that restrictive in terms of limiting only to rural areas. It's still more rural than the comparison tracts, which over 3/4 were in metro tracts. And then more of the BIP tracks were micropolitan, small town, or rural, completely rural tracks. Then turning to comparing the characteristics of these tracks, these comparison groups by initial level of number of providers at different speeds and the initial shares of households with a broadband subscription at different speeds. We see that according to the FCC data, there's a bit more providers actually in the BIP only tracks than in the comparison tracks in 2011, about 4 compared to 3 in the comparison group. But by 2016, and in 2016, there were still more providers. This is at the 200 kilobits speed. There were somewhat less at the higher speed in the BIP tracks compared to the non-BIP tracks in 2011, but by 2016, there were more of the higher speed providers in the BIP tracks. And then for the shares of households with subscriptions, there were basically more higher share in the non-BIP tracks than in the BIP tracks that had subscriptions in both years and at both speeds. Then looking at demographic and socioeconomic characteristics and how those differ between these comparison groups, in general, what we see is that the BIP tracks are a bit more rural in characteristic. So they tend to have lower, on average, lower population density. They have a higher share of the adult population with at most a high school education. They're a higher share of the population age 65 or older. A lower share of the population that's Hispanic or Black. Now the poverty rates were similar in the two groups. So in general, those are all kind of characteristics that tend to be more indicative of a rural characteristic. Also, the house values were lower in the BIP tracks, BIP only tracks, and the incomes per capita, the median incomes per capita were lower. So obviously there are differences, there are significant differences in some of the initial characteristics between the BIP only tracks and these nearby comparison tracks. And we have to address those factors because otherwise they will confound our estimates of the impact. So we use two methods to do that. We use ordinary least squares first difference regression. So we're looking at changes over time in almost all cases in the dependent variables and between BIP and non-BIP tracks. So that's kind of a first difference. But we're accounting for differences in initial conditions in these various demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. Of course, OLS can be subject to problems. It certainly depends on the parametric linearity assumptions. And so an alternative approach that is not so dependent on parametric assumptions is a matching approach where you look for matches. So in the control group of more than 31,000 census tracts that are nearby to these BIP tracts, we find ones that are very similar in terms of these initial characteristics. And then we compare the difference in the changes in the dependent variables between those matched sets of tracks. So that helps to ensure that you have an apples to apples comparison, and the results are not dependent upon a lot of parametric assumptions. But the matching approach is less efficient than OLS if the parametric assumptions of OLS are correct. So in most of the matching analysis, we use the Mahalanobis metric matching, and it has a particular distance function that it's trying to minimize. Basically, it tends to reduce the bias across all the variables. It's called equal percentage reduction of bias. But you still can have bias. It's hard to get perfect matching, especially when you have continuous covariates. And so, that's one of the reasons we prefer this approach, because Abity and Imbens have a version of that has a bias correction. So it accounts for the fact that you're not able to match perfectly the treated and control groups. And so it has auxiliary regressions that correct for biases. In most cases, we use 1-to-1 matching, but we also use 5-to-1, 5 controls per treated observation in the matching. We also use propensity score matching, both 1-to-1 and 5-to-1 in some robustness checks. I found generally that propensity score matching can often get better matches than Mahalanobis matching, but I don't know of any procedure to correct for bias with propensity score matching. So, and it's also propensity score matching results in incorrect standard errors according to Abity and Imbens. So we prefer the Mahalanobis approach, the Imbens and Abity approach. So here, one of the nice things about matching is that you can see how well you've done in terms of, matching on the covariates. So this table shows all the covariates used in the analysis and what the difference, the standardized mean differences were in these variables kind of before the matching and after, as well as the ratios of the variances of these two groups. In general, you want to, if you had perfect matching, then the match difference and mean differences would be 0, as we have for the dummy variables in the analysis, and the variance ratios should be 1. So we find in most cases that the differences are close to 0, and the variance ratios are close to 1. Although in some cases, one rule of thumb is that if it's more than 0.1 difference in the standardized difference, that's something to be of concern about bias. And so we have a few cases, for example, the matched BIP only tracks are somewhat higher in poverty and somewhat lower in median household income. So that's the use of the bias correction in this analysis. So now I'm showing the results of these different models overall. So this is for the full sample. And across the top, we see these different, in the different columns of the different dependent variables. So we looked at the change in the number of providers from 2011 to 16 at the 2 different speed levels that are available in the FCC data, and then the change in the subscription rate at the 200 kilobits speed. We don't have FCC data from 2011 on the subscription rate at 10.1. So I wasn't able to do a change regression for that. So I just looked at the regression as the level of subscription rate in 2016, controlling for the initial subscription rate and other initial conditions. And then we have change in log of house value using the ACS data, and change in the median household income. So, and then down the rows here are the different models, the OLS, Mahalanobis matching, and propensity score matching. Basically, I mean, I've highlighted the most robust results in this table, which is that across all of these models, the BIP tracks had more rapid growth in the subscription rate between these 2 years than the comparison control group. About a 2 percentage point more rapid growth in subscription rate at the 200K speed level. There's also some evidence of more growth in the number of providers at the different speeds across some of these models, but that's not robust across all the models. And in particular, these bias-corrected Mahalanobis matching estimators didn't find any, they found small and statistically insignificant effects. And then the results for all the other dependent variables were all quantitatively small and statistically insignificant. So then we looked at the effects across the rural-urban continuum. So we divided the sample into metropolitan tracts, micropolitan tracts, and small town and rural tracts, and looked at the differences. We found 3 kinds of robust findings that are highlighted here in the table. One is that in the micropolitan tracts, we found that the number of providers, the growth in the number of providers at the higher speed was greater in the BIP tracts, and that was robust. Then for the change in the subscription rate, it was only in the small town and rural tracts where we found a more rapid growth in the subscription rate. So the result that I showed on the previous slide, where there was more rapid growth in subscription rate, seems to be driven by what was happening in small town and rural tracts there. Then we have a puzzling negative result here for the effects of in metropolitan tracts, with there's slower growth in house values, median house values in the BIP tracts compared to the the other tracks. And I can, you know, that's a puzzling result, and I don't believe that that's an impact of BIP, but it suggests that there's some confounding factors that we're not able to control for here that's affecting the house value. So that's for me, it's a call for further research, not to say that BIP is reducing house values. And then we looked at how did the impacts vary across tracks according to initial availability of number of providers and initial use of broadband in terms of subscription rates. And again, the robust findings are shown here, highlighted in yellow. So we found that in tracks with at least one provider at the 200 kilobit speed in 2011, there was more rapid growth in the subscription rate in the BIP tracks. We also found that in tracks that had low broadband use, at 20% or less of households with broadband at the higher speed in 2011 had more rapid growth in the subscription rate over that 5-year period. In those same group of census tracts, we also had more growth in about a 2 to 4 percentage point estimate of more growth in median house value. That's a nice result, but given the confusing result that we found for metro tracks shown on the previous slide, I kind of have a bit of doubt about that. So we did some more checks with the data to address other concerns. So I mentioned that we used the FCC, we compared FCC subscription rate ranges, which are estimated in ranges of like 0 to 20, 20 to 40, and so on. And we looked to tracks where that estimate overlapped with the ACS confidence interval for the subscription rate from about the same time period. And then out of the more than 31,000 tracks in the full analysis, about 18,000 or so had overlap in those estimates. So then restricting the analysis to those tracks where we had, kind of congruence between the FCC and the ACS data, we ran the same analysis, got similar results for change in the number of providers at the lower speed or at both speeds, and then change in the subscription rate at the lower speed in the OLS model. There was a positive and significant result. But then we got a surprising negative significant effect on the subscriptions at 10-10-1 in the OLS model. But then none of those results were significant in the matching model. So kind of reduces the sense of robustness of the effect of BIP on the change in the subscription rate. And we also did an analysis to check for, since this is kind of a difference in difference model, we did a check for the parallel pre-BIP trends, where we had to restrict to the tracks that didn't change boundaries between 2000 and 2010. We found, again, a positive impact of BIP on the subscription rate for this sample in the post-BIP period, but that was not significant in the matching model. So, and we had insignificant impacts of BIP on the other outcomes. And then, although we had insignificant pre-BIP differences in the change of number of providers, we had significantly more pre-BIP growth in the subscription rate in the BIP census tracts than the comparison group. So there was a prior difference prior to the 2010 in the growth rates of subscription rates, which kind of undermines, our confidence to some extent in that we're looking at a true positive impact of BIP on the subscription rate. So finally, to conclude, we found that BIP in many of these analyses, it had a positive impact on broadband subscription, increasing the subscription rate by about 2 percentage points, but that result wasn't robust across all of our robustness checks. The positive impact of BIP on the subscription rate was greatest in small town and rural tracts, and in tracts with low broadband subscription rate in 2011, and in tracts with more than one broadband provider in 2011. BIP also appears to have had a positive impact on the number of broadband providers in the micropolitan tracts. Then we had a positive association with growth in median house values in tracts with low broadband use in 2011, but then we had that surprising negative association with growth in median house values in the metro tracts. So that kind of undermined my confidence in the results for the house values. And I think really, you know, we want to investigate these impacts at the parcel level rather than the census tract level, using data, parcel level sales data from CoreLogic. So that's something we're planning for future research. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Are there any quick clarification questions that folks want to raise? There was one question to the panelists about that negative effect on metropolitan housing prices. And Brian, you had a response to that question. Could you comment on that quickly?
Sure. I mean, it's striking that he only found that in metro areas, right? And so, John, I'd actually like to see you run it just by the individual RUC codes 1, 2, and 3. And so my hypothesis is those BIP funds went to like the outlying bedroom communities, and those haven't seen the skyrocketing, housing values that maybe the more densely populated areas have. And so maybe that's what's driving it. But I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, I will say that we are, so I was controlling for, well, actually in this case, we're only looking at metropolitan tracts, right? So I guess your suggestion, I mean, one suggestion to deal with that could be to get more refined, to use the RUCA codes, or, you know, some of these, yeah, the RUCA codes, we could distinguish between bedroom communities that are outlying and then the more central census tracts, you know, within the urban core. So that could be something to try to control for, to address your point.
Any other quick clarification questions before we move on? I'm not seeing any in the chat box. Before I shift over and start my presentation, I wanted to, hang on here, I'm trying to get my...
John, oh yeah, thank you, John.
Yeah.
And I gotta click that. I'm still trying to figure out, can't teach an old dog new tricks type of comment. Oh, I wanted to make sure that everyone knew that Madam President Dawn Tilmany has joined us. So I want to welcome Dawn. I also want to congratulate her on being kind of a CRENET member, longstanding, and just want to wish her well in her role as president. And she's been handed a difficult task with COVID and the meetings going virtual and everything. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Dawn.
Well, I even got unmuted, so I'm really special. But thanks, everyone. And I don't know how many of you got to listen to my address, but I made sure to give CRENET a special shout out for being well ahead of their time and figuring out how to make a community of practice. So I'm proud to say I'm affiliated with you guys, and I'll be quiet now and just listen and learn.
Thank you, Dawn. Let me go ahead and start on the formal discussion comments. And I want to start off a little bit by kind of overviewing some of the, reiterating some of the issues that both Brian and John brought up that I think are kind of takeaway, is that access to broadband has really become a necessary and it's not just a sufficient condition. You almost have to have it for community economic well-being. It's not, when I talk to a lot of state legislators here in Wisconsin, some of them still think that it's kind of a luxury. But it's not, it's a necessity now. What we're experiencing with COVID right now has really kind of driven home the necessity for broadband. It's kind of piqued interest. I know in Wisconsin, the governor has announced a Blue Ribbon Commission for rural broadband. A lot of times when you announce a Blue Ribbon Commission, that's kind of the kiss of death. Because it's this general sign that policymakers want to just kind of, let's just bury the issue. We'll put it into a Blue Ribbon Commission. But I think there's going to be some momentum behind this. But I think the thing that's really coming out now is that it's not just access to quality broadband, but it's affordability of that broadband. I think that's something that we're kind of missing. This is really coming evident with remote schooling, homeschooling, and whatnot. the debate or the policy discussion has generally been about rural access. The cost of the last mile is too prohibitive in sparsely populated areas. That's a general, but the cost linked to income are often overlooked. For example, if we look at the most recent FCC data, and this is the percent of households that with access. The darker the color here, the lower the rates of access. And you can see that, you know, there are some really strong spatial patterns here, but you know, when you start to cluster in on, say, you know, Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, there seems to be something else going on here than simply access to broadband. But again, if you do look at the kind of the rural aspect here, this is just a simple scatter plot of Wisconsin counties, population densities, and the percent of households that have access to broadband. Again, broadband defined as 25.3. You do see that there is a clear rural pattern here, but I think there's more to it than that. If we flip to and use the American Community Survey data, and you break out the percent of households that have no access to the internet by income levels, across the board, you see these lower income, less than $20,000 of income, have no access. One of the issues that we're running into in Wisconsin is that even if you build access, and it's quality access, the cost is too prohibitive for a lot of households. We had one project in Madison here where there was a low-income subsidized apartment complex, and the city went in and basically said, we're going to subsidize broadband as an experiment in this apartment complex. And they had to pull the plug after about a year and a half, because even at a reduced subsidized rate of $19.99 a month, that was too much for a lot of people living in these low-income housing. So it's not just access, it's cost. And I think we're kind of missing that, okay? We know that the data is terribly flawed. And I think that we need to keep hammering this home. But there is the broadband deployment accuracy of technology that was passed last March, and it was signed by the president, but it's going to take some time for the quality of the data to start to pick up. Now, my question is that can we use the American Community Survey, not for access for things like income and all that, but actually using that data to kind of get an idea of you know, an alternative to the FCC data. Some work that I've been doing is using county level data and trying to build an index that bridges the FCC data and the American Community Survey data. And I built this little index here using principal components that basically says, you know, satellite. A lot of folks in rural areas say, well, just use satellite data. Well, if all you're doing is streaming Netflix and sports games and maybe doing email, satellite's fine. But if you're trying to do a Zoom or distance education over satellite, it doesn't work. It also gets extremely expensive as you use up data, which means that it's not viable for low income. A lot of folks are basically saying, yeah, I've got a smartphone. That's my access to the internet. And that's not adequate. And no internet access at all. And you can kind of see that there's, you know, this data kind of seems to complement itself. So I think maybe we need to explore that a little bit more. Now, one of the comment is John mentions that they use the FCC data or the American Community Survey data to kind of, and he kind of touched on that, but I maybe when the paper's finally, you know, the paper's fully flushed out, there could be a little bit of clarification on that. But I don't see how they use it, okay? So some comments on John's paper. Broadband investment, it's a high priority. These are basically, I cut and pasted some of his comments here, some of his bullet points. But this is something that I got from Tessa Conroy, who I think stole it from Sarah Lowe, her Southern Regional Science Association presidential address. And I think the point here is that when we look at how much money the federal government has invested, and you look at rural electrification, the telephone service, maybe you can explain that to me, Sarah. But the amount of money that we've really put into broadband is really a drop in the bucket. John kind of said that the investment in rural broadband coming out of the American Recovery Act was significant. in comparison to other programs, yes, it is significant, but it's still a drop in the bucket. And I think that that's kind of one of the concerns that we have here, is that we're throwing money at it, but we're really not throwing very much money at it. In Wisconsin, we've put the state legislature through something like $30 million at rural broadband. That's really nothing. I mean, it's really kind of a drop in the ocean. Now, a couple of things here on John's paper, and he clarified it through the presentation. But this is kind of a technical question I had for John, and he responded to it. But my point here is that if you look at the number of tracks that have gotten BIP funding compared to the number of tracks that could be eligible, that's not a whole lot of tracks. Now, not from a methodological question, because I think John addresses it with his propensity score matching. But the point here is that this funding is not really getting out to a whole lot of rural communities. Okay, so it's not a lot of money in the bigger scheme of things, and it's not really hitting a lot of rural areas. I would love the one map that John has, and I should have reproduced it here, is I would love to find out why are some of these rural communities getting this money and other rural communities are not getting these funds? What's the driving difference between those two? Are some rural communities, do we have some rural communities that are more aggressive at getting these funds? Are they more dynamic communities to begin with and are better able to leverage the resources that are out there? Now, this is the first set of results, and I like the propensity score matching. I really like the way that you do that, and it's a nice robustness check to kind of compare and contrast different ways of doing it. A lot of statistically insignificant result, and John and I have talked about that, and there's about a 2% increase in subscriptions. Okay, is 2%, is that really economically significant? It's statistically significant, but is it economically significant? How many households are we talking about here with a 2% increase? What's the rate of return on the investment there? The other thing is that the ability, who's getting those new subscriptions? Is it lower income households or is it higher income households? Okay, some specific comments here. Again, the larger bullet points are direct copies from John's presentation. My first comment here is the broadband speeds. The FCC now says that broadband is 25.3, but the question really here is one was the technical question, why are we using these lower speeds? But I think a broader question is, what is the appropriate speed? What really is viable broadband? And I'm not sure that we can answer that question clearly. Is 25.3 kind of like the necessary condition? Is it something lower? Is it something higher? I don't think we have a really good idea of what is the adequate level of speed. Number of different broadband providers. Much of the funding here, and this is a frustration that we're seeing in Wisconsin, is that much of the funding has to go to the service providers. It can't go to the municipalities. It has to go to the service providers. Now, the small service providers that tend to work with rural communities are better positioned to take advantage of these things. The problem is that a lot of the larger service providers, they're taking this money and they're investing it in upgrading their existing infrastructure. They're not building out new infrastructure. They're upgrading what they currently have. One of the problems that we've got in Wisconsin is that these service providers are taking the money, but there's no follow-up in terms of what they're doing with the money. Okay, and the big service providers, they're notorious for not returning phone calls. And I think that maybe we need to start thinking about who's that money going to. Okay, the median house, I think we've already talked about that, so I'm just going to go ahead and skip over that. Okay, now on to Brian's paper. I really like this paper. Again, the 3 core points, the levels of broadband with full employees, existence of sustainable funding mechanisms in addition to the federal, and the state restrictions on what municipalities can do. This last one, I think, is really extremely important. It's been a real thorn in the side of a lot of Wisconsin communities. And I think that we need to keep coming back to that. So what we've got is essentially this, many states are saying, yes, rural broadband is an issue and we need to address rural broadband, but, and they're throwing money at it, they're creating offices, but at the same time, a lot of them are hamstringing what local municipalities can do. So we're kind of saying, okay, well, we're throwing money at it. And we've created this office, but we're not going to let you really do anything that's innovative and novel. I'd love to go back and look at this particular result in more detail. I'll go ahead and, Brian mentioned that the paper's been accepted. It's not quite yet in preprint. I was one of the reviewers for the paper, and I've already been taking this result and going out around the state talking about this particular result. I think this has really major implications, okay? Again, this is just kind of the results. The state funds available is increasing a little bit, but these municipal restrictions are really kind of hamstringing what local municipalities can do. I think that's a real problem. So the grants help, but limiting the flexibility of municipalities is counterproductive. This last finding is extremely important. Are state offices really in the form of window dressing? Are there some state offices that are more effective than others? If yes, then why? Maybe dig into that result a little bit deeper as a next step in the research is to find out, because I know that this is something Ron Schaefer ran into with the rural development councils. There were some councils that were pretty dynamic and pretty aggressive, and there were some councils where they were just a good old boy network. And I can imagine that some of these state broadband offices are exactly that. There are some that are really pretty good, and there are some that are really pretty bad. Can we get into that? Okay. The broadband data stinks. I'm not going to share that. That's been talked about before, but I think that if we could walk out of this session with some brainstorming ideas on how to address this broadband issue. I think the other thing is, again, the next stage in this paper is to kind of move away from a simple dummy variable. The fact that Wisconsin pops out as one of the most restrictive is a thorn in our side here. So I'd like to see more work done on that, maybe the next round of the paper. So I'm going to stop with that and kind of give a shout out to our next presentation. But for now, let's open it up to general discussion. And I'm just going to leave this screen here, if that's okay, Sarah.
Thanks, Steve.
If there aren't any questions or comments from the broader group, I can give a few responses to some of Steve's points, if that's okay.
Could you please, John? And you too, sure. Brian, if you would like to. If there's no general questions.
Yeah, so thanks, Steve. I really appreciate all your comments, all very good comments. Just a couple of responses. So I really like the chart that you showed. I think it was from Sarah's presentation, and it's a good point to show how much more we spent on rural electrification and the highway system than we have on broadband. So part of the challenge, I think, for me is to get Congress, to get decision makers to fund a lot more investment. They may want to know that they're what the rate of return on that is, and so that's part of what motivates me to do this research. And would Congress be, they still might make an argument that, even if there's not the economic rate of return, it's still it's a public good, or it's you can argue that it's necessary, as you said, for just to be in a modern world. So maybe that's the argument that has to be made. I was thinking, well, if you can show that there's a return, then that makes the argument easier, I guess, but so far what I'm seeing, at least for the BIP program, hasn't really borne out. We didn't see any, according to Roback theory, equilibrium, spatial equilibrium theory, if you had well-functioning or, costless migration, which is, probably not true, but you have a tendency for the benefits of infrastructure to be capitalized into property values. And we're not seeing any of that, or pretty much very little of that. There was one exception to that. And then, where you talked about the what's the economic significance of a 2 percentage point increase in subscription rate? Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. You know, I would have liked to be able to, I think it's more economically significant if we show an impact on incomes or on property values. So it's, in my view of the subscription rate and so on, it's more of an instrumental kind of thing, you know, that I expect that you have to see some increase in that in order to affect these economic outcomes. And it is, you know, admittedly a fairly, you know, seems like a fairly small impact, but I haven't thought about how we could turn that into some kind of economic measure. Finally, you raised a question about why focus on the low speeds. You know, I mean, one point I would make is that we're talking about 25.3 now, but back in 2010 and 2011, I don't think anybody was talking about 25.3. That certainly wasn't the FCC standard for broadband at that time. And so the standards for broadband are always increasing. You know, what qualifies as broadband is increasing. It's an increasing, you know, it's a moving target. So even if rural areas catch up, you know, on the 25.3, then probably some new technology will come out and they'll be behind again. So, you know, we were focusing on what the FCC reported in its data, and also I think the 3 megabytes, 768 kilobits upload may have been something in the National Broadband Plan back in 2010. So I think that's some of the reason for those speed levels that were discussed there.
Yeah, I think, you know, the reason I brought up the speed question was kind of more of a clarification question of what was your logic behind that. But, you know, saying that you're looking back over time and it's a moving target, I get that. But it does raise the larger question of what, you know, what is the relevant speed for economic development?
Right.
I think one of the things, I mean, the looking at the housing capitalization, I think that's a good idea. And I wouldn't read too much into that urban result. I think there's something going on there that just isn't quite getting captured right. I think it should be focused on rural. And one of the, you know, as we've been playing around with some of this data, particularly that one index that I kind of shared with you, the one result that's getting stronger and stronger is student achievement. I think with, you know, at-home schooling now, I think that the time is right to kind of say that, you know, you have to have access to broadband for educational purposes and kind of shift away from entrepreneurship, shift away from employment growth, maybe shift away from, you know, housing values and focus on not having broadband. Affordable broadband is putting a lot of kids at a disadvantage, and it's going to widen the income gap. So it's another way of it's another angle to come at it.
I had 2 undergrads this year do that exact analysis. We looked at Oklahoma school districts, and of course there are some districts with terrible connectivity and low proportion of students with the computer. And we actually looked at district level test scores and control for income and demographics and all that kind of stuff. And we didn't show a huge impact of the connectivity. But it was there. I mean, it was statistically significant. So it's at least a starting point. When we get that, it's probably not going to be a journal article quality, but it'll at least be a fact sheet. So I'll happy to share that with you.
Also, I think it'll be really interesting once we have the data to look at what's happened during this pandemic. You know, then you may see much bigger impacts on school achievement and so on, of broadband access.
And John, just one more thing. I thought your results were striking. It's actually interesting if you look at the FCC's own data on who actually subscribes at a 25.3 level. Most people are not paying for a 25.3 line. They're paying for something much lower. So if you don't think you need, you know, all these fancy speeds, then you can just get a 3 megabits per second. And so actually that's something that's interesting. It's in the SEC annual report. It's the actual rate of subscription at those speeds is much lower than the availability.
You know, and I check out of curiosity what, you know, my home speed is, and my wife and I are empty nesters and we both telecommute, and we're averaging 8.2 by the monitor here, and that's fine. But yet I've got a colleague who both he and his wife telecommute, and they've got kids at home that are trying to distance education, and they've got 25.3, if not higher, and it bogs down on them. So it depends on the number of users that they've got. It also depends on, I mean, Sarah, you've got that example of that rural manufacturer who tried to download a piece of equipment software upgrade, and what should have taken an hour took 3 days. So, I mean, it gets back to this, how fast is fast enough? Now, the problem with satellite as an alternative is that it's very sketchy. If you're trying to download a big data file and it hiccups, you got to start all over again. And it hiccups a lot. The other thing is, it's like a cell phone plan. You have a certain amount of data that you can use. And if you go over that, watch out, your bill's going to explode. So satellite's not a good alternative, unless all you're doing is streaming Netflix and football games.
I think you guys bring up a lot of good issues, and 3 things that kind of build on that. This is Dawn. I put this in the chat box, but it'll be interesting because through CARES, they are giving out all these block grants to states. And I swear I heard through our economic development community, some of it was going to be targeting broadband, because we do have, you know, some pretty significant pockets of Colorado whose students couldn't go online even if they wanted to. But that actually might be an interesting project even for the committee, since all of us are in so many different states, is to hunt down if any of the resilience money that came in got targeted at that because of particularly education concerns. You know, the second thing is, of course, we're Colorado, so everybody who now thinks they're going to be working remotely for a long time is funneling into our state. And almost all of our rural counties are saying, for people who either have Airbnbs or campsites even and stuff, that, you know, the first question is, what is your speed? But it's like Steve said, well, it depends. The speed right now is this, but if literally you have a huge density of people trying to do work from home or even bring their kids and do schooling from, you know, showing their kids the West, that all can change pretty quickly if you all of a sudden increase the density in some of these rural areas. And that's something our state is definitely gonna face. And then third, we also saw a lot of businesses go online. You know, Sarah and Jeff O'Hara had that paper on online sales. Well, another paper Sarah and I did, you know, they're talking about volume of sales through farms going up somewhere between 300% and 500% on online platforms.
Yeah.
Again, you know, that's where you have to have a very visually interesting website, doing the actual transaction probably at the site. So I think there's just so many dimensions that have changed even in the last 6 months, that there's going to be a lot of interest about these papers in the policy arena. But of course, they're immediately going to want to know, well, but what now? And as you know, you all have said, this is just all changing even yearly before this event. And I think this event's probably going to accelerate any investments that were being made.
2 quick count. Brian, you posted something to the panelists on a paper about adoption and productivity. Could you repost that to everybody?
Oh, sorry, I thought I did.
I think it just went to the panelists. The second thing is there's an interesting thing going on with Silicon Valley right now, is with the COVID, so many people telecommuting, that a lot of the high-tech companies are basically renegotiating contracts with a lot of employees that if you take a cut in pay, you can telecommute. And it's to such an extent that you're actually seeing rent values in San Francisco going down. So this creates an opportunity for a lot of high amenity rural communities, is that you can come live in this high amenity area, whether it's Colorado, northern Wisconsin, or beautiful parts of Appalachia, but you got to have broadband to do it. So I think there's an opportunity here, the timing of such that for a lot of rural communities to kind of say, hey, there's a structural shift that's occurring in terms of telecommuting, and we're being left to the side because we can't meet that broadband requirement. Are we scheduled to go to 2:30? You're muted.
Yep, we're scheduled to go to 2:30. Any comments from anyone else for the panel before we close for the day? If not, I'd like to thank the speakers, Brian and John and your co-authors. I'd like to thank John for organizing, Stephen for moderating, and I think we had up to 44 participants at one point. So I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. Any last questions coming in?
And Sarah, thank you for hosting.
Absolutely. I'd love to encourage anyone who's still online to let the CRENET leadership team, that's me, Jeff O'Hara, and Craig Carpenter, let us know if there are other ideas you'd like to see CRENET do this year. Hopefully we'll be able to meet face-to-face next summer, but we're looking for opportunities to particularly engage our young and new members and help them get networked. Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank
Have a
you.
good rest of the day.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Brian.